Hi, everybody, my beautiful friends and family out there. I'm so happy to be here again, and I'm in Tucson, where I'm always happy to be, with my friend David Collis, my good friend.
Hello, everybody out there.
And you may have seen the video where I interviewed David about his book titled Interviewing Jesus the Man. And then just a few nights ago at David's house, I did the Lemurian code activation with him. So there's a video in my YouTube about that also. But today we're going to talk about something we don't get to talk about, and that's the role of women in Jesus's ministry. Now, I was raised Catholic, and I was just saying to David, our role models from the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Catholic Church are not empowering women at all, not that I have found. And so that was one of the reasons I left it, the baby, the bathwater, and the bathtub, all of it, when I was 15. That was the end for me. Now, since then, I've healed my personal relationship with Jesus, Yeshua, Sananda, and I feel very good about that. But I know that because I asked the women in my circles, how many of you have had this experience? 80%. 80%. So
that's a big number.
Yeah, it is. And what I'd like to hear from you, because you've researched this so extensively, is what really in your research was the role of women in Jesus' ministry and his relationship to the women in his life. And, you know, I know that there's a lot there, and there will be when you start making statements like this.
Yes.
There, you know, you ruffle feathers, and I kind of understand that I'm here to do that. And so you don't have to agree with what I say or what I think or what I feel or what David is purporting, but it will give you a new way to look at this.
All right, so let's just go back to your Catholicism. Okay. So what we're going to see in Catholicism is three roles for women. One, you have the virgin birth, or Virgin Mary, right, the mother of God. You have women as prostitutes,
right,
and you have women as mothers. Okay, so you have pretty much three archetypes that all women seem to have fit within a mold. Mm-hmm. And even in the first century at Jesus's time, we have prostitution, we have women who were demon-possessed, and we have the domestic role of women in their lives. Mm-hmm. Okay, so outside of that, women really had almost nothing.
That's it, yeah.
Almost nothing.
Yeah.
So they were not allowed, even if they were educated, they were not allowed to teach. Mm-hmm. They were midwives, so we're still dealing with the nature of the domestic life, the home, the women who keep the fire of the heart, right, the home going. And they were also subservient to the man, whether they were to their father or whether they were to their husband. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we actually get into the New Testament Gospels. Does the New Testament Gospels portray women in the same way? Curiously, they do. However, with my research, Jesus started to bring something different into the world. And it seems to be, from my research, that idea was minimized.
The idea of what Jesus brought as women's roles.
That's right.
Okay.
So instead of making the role of women to be just mothers and daughters and the women of the domestic life, the keeping the fire of the hearth, Jesus wanted to expand that role. Mm-hmm. And he allowed women to be part of his ministry, not only to support and encourage, but also to follow along, which was outside of the bounds of being in the home.
Of what was going on at the time.
Exactly.
In society, yeah.
Right. So one of the things about Jesus' ministry is that he was interested in bringing a new kingdom. Mm-hmm. He was interested in bringing in inclusivity, so people were part of this new kingdom. He was interested in minimizing the separating roles that people were engaged in. So, and this included women, but it also dealt with those who were stigmatized, those who were demon-possessed, those who were sick and infirmed. And he was trying to break and bridge this gap between those who over there are sinful and they have to stay over there, and how Jesus wanted to work, which is I want to include them into I wanted to include them into my ministry and into this new kingdom. So we have, in a sense, a brotherhood, a unity, and love, which was his motivating force. And Jesus brought a whole new idea of the divine into the world. He called it the Father, and he showed the way of the Father, and that included how he treated women.
That's really interesting and new. It's really new. And, you know, it comes to me that why am I doing this with you? And why do I feel this is important? And I'm not doing this only because David's my neighbor now. He lives right there. I can see his house, and it's wonderful that he and his wife are my neighbors, and that, you know, we have other spiritual connections. But what Spirit has asked of me in bringing the Lemurian Sisterhood through is from the distant past. And I really believe that so many of us in the past 2,000 years have this broken relationship with Christianity, Catholicism, Jesus, the ministry, the women, it's just broken and no good. And how can we go on? I mean, we can ignore it and we can pretend it doesn't exist or never existed and not, you know, recognize it or use it in our lives, and many people do. But why not heal that relationship? Why not have a new understanding? And something that I continue to learn is that as we grow in wisdom and understanding, the past starts to look different to us.
Yes.
And our past gets healed. So for me, that's what these conversations with David are about, is healing the past so that we can have a new understanding of ourselves through the eyes of the past.
And what better way to try to understand the nature of women except to look at them in relationship to what they can bring to the table. And women are very intuitive, they're very intelligent, they're very dedicated, they're very loyal. And there have been a number of women in my life who I have been influenced by, and they are like prophetesses. They are the women who are channelers. They are women who are bringing a new vision of the women into the world, and the role of women to actually lead us through kind of this valley of the shadow of death, so to speak, and bring us out into a new kind of light. And it's bringing back that feminine element, of which back in the first century there was almost nothing about that at all.
Would you say that a lot of the what you call demon-possessed women or people were others that had an idea of an expanded idea of women's abilities?
That's definitely one of the ideas. In fact, in Jewish culture, if you were a woman who was considered a witch, you were stoned to death. So they really did not like any ideas that were supernatural or spirit-filled, mystical. And even the men were under the same pressure. So the prophets that were inspired by God and shown new visions, as Jesus said, even prophets are, dishonored. Even in their own
you got to be careful.
So a lot of anything that dealt with a personal relationship and a personal connection was looked on upon very badly, and it was frowned upon. So because it's the idea of the written word and the idea of logic and philosophy or theology that was the overriding emphasis, and then of course the practices. So they understood the role of everybody, and they wanted to put everybody within that little box. In the box. And so you had the king over here on one side, and you had the priests and the Pharisees on this other side, and they figured out the kind of the theology of it all and how you're supposed to relate to it. And they gave it to you to do. Right. It wasn't a path of exploration to find your spiritual self. No. By any means. So when you finally get to Jesus, we have exactly the opposite, which is he is exploring himself, and he is exploring the new idea of the divine, and he is bringing a new vision of the divine into the world, and he calls it the Father, and he also calls it the Kingdom of Heaven.
And it includes women in a big way.
And it includes women.
So this may be a little jump ahead, but I'm fascinated by the Mary Magdalene story as it unfolds and becomes known in different ways. Because as I was raised, she was a prostitute who washed Jesus's feet, and he forgave her for her sins. Period. And maybe if she followed him around, she was way at the back of the bus.
Right.
And so that's the parentheses around Mary Magdalene in my life. And now the Catholic Church has said that she wasn't a prostitute. So I'm not sure they're going to write the Bibles differently, but give us some story there, some other ways to look at who she was and what she was in Jesus' life.
Okay. So there are several different parts to this. One is that in the Gospel of Luke, Mary is part of the list of women of means. She's also part of the list of women who were cured of their sicknesses and their illnesses and being demon-possessed. So we now recognize that she was a woman of means, meaning she was a wealthy woman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Aside from that, we don't know much about her at all until we get to the very end of Jesus' life, in which she is now one of the witnesses to his crucifixion. So she is now watching Jesus crucified, bleeding, he's bloodied, his body is destroyed, and he is in agony. So she's witnessing his death. After he dies, she is part of the group of women, as well as Joseph of Arimathea, who brings him down off of the cross, and then they put him into the tomb. She's also part of the women who create the spices to put onto his body after it's been wrapped.
Okay.
So since the time that they wanted to put the spices on him happened to be on the Sabbath, they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath, so they had to wait till the next day, of which she ended up going to the tomb, and the tomb was empty. So she was the first also to recognize that there was the empty tomb. And then she was the first to run back to the disciples to let them know that the tomb was empty. And then she followed Peter back to the tomb. So those are the New Testament descriptions of Mary and what the role that she had. It was all at the very end of Jesus' life, with the one exception that she was part of these women of means that helped support him and be with him.
Okay.
So that's the New Testament.
Okay.
Now there are other sources, primarily in the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas, where that role is expanded.
So can we put a pin in that for a second? The Gospel of Mary, where is that in our Bible?
Well, the Gospel of Mary comes from the Gnostics. And so the Gnostics were Christians. The Gnostics and the Christians actually had a very dynamic relationship at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. So after his death, they were all together.
Okay.
It's my assessment that after the temple fell in the year 70, that there was a split, because what held them together was their disdain for the temple. So the temple was kind of the glue that held them all together.
Okay.
Once the temple fell, then the idea of Christianity started to re-examine itself on what lines did it want to go down. So there are two primary lines. The one line, the one vein, the one river was Jesus died for your sins. So that's what we get in the New Testament. Okay. The other line, the Gnostic line, is that Jesus showed us the way back to the Father, which is a conceptual relationship, and one that you have with the Father. So he opened up the door for us to re-experience the inner self and our relationship that we can have with the Father.
Whether you were a man or a woman.
Exactly.
It was all inclusive.
Okay. So when we get down into the Gospel of Mary and we get down into the Gospel of Thomas, both of them are located within the Gnostic traditions.
Okay.
So in the Gospel of Mary, it is said that Jesus kissed Mary on and then there's a big blank. And we presume that she kissed, or that Jesus kissed her on the lips. And if it's on the lips, that makes it mean that she was most likely Jesus's wife. So again, we don't know what body part that he kissed her on, but there was a level of intimacy there. Okay. This also then gets magnified when you look at her role in the Gospel of Thomas. And in that role, she has a special relationship with Jesus, where Jesus not only confides in her, more so than the disciples, he also shares with her deeper hidden wisdom that the other disciples do not get. The other men don't get. And now they're very, very upset that Jesus is showing
the good stuff to her and not to them.
It's preferential treatment to her. So you now have to kind of expand this relationship as to why Jesus would be kissing her and why he would be telling her new information.
Well, and if he was about inclusivity, and I assume there maybe was, you know, since he had apostles, he didn't tell the general public that the same thing he told the apostles, right? And then
well, just remember, it's disciples at this point. The apostles are the ones after Jesus' death. So we have this two separation, and we have to kind of keep those in.
Disciples.
We have to keep that in our focus. That there is Jesus with his disciples and his followers, and then there's, after Jesus' death, we have those people who are now going to be propagating his story and his teachings.
Okay. So the disciples, of which Mary Magdalene was one, are upset that Jesus is teaching her stuff.
That's right.
And they're not,
most likely because they're incapable of understanding the deeper truth.
And she
so now that he is telling her these deeper truths, that means something else, which means she had the mind to receive it.
Okay, got it.
So that meant that she was a very smart woman.
And mystical.
And mystical. Most likely she was mystical like Jesus' mother Mary, who was receiving the angels. So she had to have some very deep connection to the mystical side of things, because Jesus did too. So it's almost maybe, you know, Mary had a mystical side to her, and whether it's genetics or whatnot, Jesus received the same. The same makeup.
Or perhaps he awakened it, you know, it's like.
There's always the possibility of always awakening ourselves. And Jesus knew how to do that. My feeling is that there was already something inside of Jesus that awoke, as there was with his mother Mary. Now the question is how did the other disciples understand what that meant? So now on a mystical level, on a mythic level, the way that I see the New Testament is that you have the virgin birth, and that's who we are. Inside of ourselves, there's an aspect of the divine that is lying. It's asleep. It's dormant.
Okay, so wait. So you're saying that we all are virgin births?
When we awaken to the divine, that is a divine birth, and that is considered a virgin birth.
So we're going from just sort of our everyday selves into our spiritual selves.
That's correct. And that process, that awakening, is a type of a virgin birth.
So that's what we're talking about with Mary, the mother of Jesus.
That's
her virgin. She was.
Well, they like to go ahead and make it literal that Jesus was born from a virgin birth. Virgin just meant that he was a young girl. All right. So now we have the whole other spiritual dimension that was added into the story. Okay, I can't say that that's true or not. I just kind of assume that it falls within the guidelines of what other women within other regions, and I'm sure the people who were writing the New Testament Gospels were aware of this, but anybody who was extraordinary all came from virgin birth mothers. Whether it was Alexander the Great or the Buddha or Socrates or Plato, there was a number. So it was all part of this emphasis to say Jesus was special. So that's really what it means, is that there's something so special about this man that he couldn't have been human.
And there was bringing.
And there was something extra human about it. And so that's the way I look at this.
So back to Mary M.
Yes, Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene. What about, so he's teaching her these things that he's not teaching anyone else.
That's right.
The disciples are not so happy about that?
Most of them are not very happy, and then we also see that Peter seems to always be is not happy with her. So when you kind of go back and you look at the New Testament from the epistle point of view and the book of Acts point of view, you have to kind of keep asking yourself what's missing.
Right.
And this is one of those elephants in the room. What happened to Mary Magdalene?
Right.
Okay, so
she didn't vaporize.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So now we get into a very interesting subject matter, and that is, it is my belief and is my conviction that Jesus and Mary were married, and that after Jesus came, well, first of all, when Jesus decided to go onto his ministry, it just created a big rift in his family. So much so that even his mother and his brothers came to him and said, "He's crazy. We need to take him."
Because they were traditional.
His father was considered very righteous,
Okay.
which means that was very, very traditional way of thinking about things. And guess what his brothers' names are? He has 4 brothers. You have James, which is a derivative of Jacob's.
Right.
You have Simon, Judas, and Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, James, which is a derivative of Jacob, and Joseph are both patriarchs. And Simon and Judas are both part of the rebellion that got rid of the Greeks before Jesus' time by a couple hundred years.
Okay.
So we have within his family a very strong sense of self-identity.
Right.
We are Jews and we resist.
And these are the ways this is what our teachings say, and this is
Right.
how we live in the world.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm sure his family household followed these guidelines. And because it says that he enjoyed Passover all the time.
Right.
So even as a 10-year-old boy or 12-year-old boy, they were going to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So here they are in the Galilee, and they're going to Jerusalem to spend time for Passover, and he's doing it on a regular basis. Well, they were a wealthy family because they were able to do this so frequently. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the parts of their wealth, is that they can spend the 2 or 3 weeks.
So here comes this bad boy.
Yeah. So now Jesus is a troublemaker, and he has his own mystical experiences, and he's now pushing that on to the family and then into his community, and he's being rejected. Mm. And his brother James is very devout in the old ways, and so he can't really accept Jesus for what he had to bring, which is rather interesting because at the end of Jesus's life, he comes around, and James now becomes the father of the Jerusalem church. So what was his transformation? What was his art?
So we had a little, when we were talking earlier, about the gap in time.
Right.
That not only that Mary Magdalene disappears, but that Jesus disappears. We don't know. Well, we weren't told where he was. He was a kid, and then he was 30.
Right.
So there's that gap. Was Mary gone somewhere with him? Were the disciples all gone somewhere? Was it? From what I've read since then, there are a lot of different stories. There's a lot of speculation, but that he was in all these different places, receiving different kinds of training to make him ready for his ministry.
Right.
And some of these things say Mary was with him. Some say the disciples were with him. Some say he went off by himself. Some say there were aliens involved. So,
right.
So what is your take on all of that?
All right. This is where it gets really fascinating. Jesus doesn't mention anything in his sayings where he went.
Okay.
There's no reference to India. There's no reference to England. There's no reference to Egypt.
Okay.
There's none.
Okay.
However, when you compare him with Paul likes to tell you everything, or what he did.
Yeah.
Paul loves to say, I went here, I went there, I went this, and then this happened to me, and this is who I am, and this is my lineage. Jesus doesn't do any of that.
Okay.
So now we get to compare and contrast the two ways that these two are thinking. How come Jesus is always minimizing who he is? Mm-hmm. And why is Paul always interested in telling people who he is? So we have 2 different personality traits. Mm-hmm. But Jesus also had a very proud, arrogant, self-assured way about him. And he was a bit of a troublemaker. Mm-hmm. And yet his sayings are all about, his sayings involve other things than himself.
Right.
Okay.
Oh.
So Paul likes to include himself in what he's doing to let everybody know. Jesus does not. So Jesus doesn't let on where he went. Mm-hmm. However, his teachings give us some indication as to where he might have gone. So we have three options. There's a number of sayings in Jesus. Excuse me. There's a number of Jesus sayings that have a very strong Eastern influence. Mm. He uses the kingdom of heaven as like a mustard seed. Mustard seed, the idea of the seed is very Buddhist. Mm-hmm. When he says the Father and I are one, that's a very Hindu concept. Mm-hmm. When he says to consider the lilies of the field, this is a very Taoist concept. Mm-hmm. When in the Gospel of Thomas, there is a parable where he says, there was a woman, I'm paraphrasing, there's a woman who was carrying a jar of meal, and unbeknownst to her, the handle was broken, and the meal poured out behind her. When she got home, she opened the lid and she realized the jar was empty. Again, that's the empty jar of Buddhism. Okay. So Jesus' ministry also includes the idea that the Father becomes bigger and I become less. So there's this idea of expansion and contraction. Again, that's a Buddhist idea. Yeah. So his ministry is about the loss of the ego to allow love and compassion to come through him. That's Buddhist. Yeah. And then the other thing that he mentions, he says, the measure you use is the measure used on you. Right. And that's karma. Yeah. Okay. Where did all of these ideas come from? Because those ideas are not Hebrew. Right. Definitely not. Okay. So now we have to address that particular idea. Mm-hmm. So if you look to the Eastern religions, then it would make sense that Jesus went there. However, is it possible that Jesus could have had some type of spiritual experience that would bring him into that fold because those ideas are universal? So does Jesus have to go over there to learn it, or can Jesus actually have a very profound experience that would initiate him into that? But whatever it was, Jesus prepared himself for this ministry. He just didn't wake up one morning and say, "Hi, everybody, I think I'm going to go on ministry now." Yeah. That didn't happen. Right. The arc of his evolution and the arc of anybody's evolution never allows that to happen. You can't just say, "Hey, you know what? I think I'll go play baseball now, and I'm at the Dodger Stadium, and they're in the World Series, and somehow I'm going to go down to the field and go get a home run and win the game with a home run." That won't happen. You can't flip a switch. So you can't do that. So there's a whole level of preparation that had to have occurred for Jesus. One, not only to let all this information marinate and gestate and come to fruition, but it also, he had to prepare his own body. I mean, this was a very rigorous kind of a thing. To hold that vibration and all of the wisdom and teaching. And Jesus, he was a very hardy individual. So he was a carpenter. He had to plane down wood. He had to hammer wood. He had to do what a carpenter does. And things are heavy. Well, and just his physical DNA lineage before he started doing any of that, they're hardy folks. They're very hardy. And the Galileans were very hardy folks. I kind of look at them as like kind of the eastern seaboard of the Americas. It was like in your face, very aggressive, constantly just pushing ideas and whatnot. So we don't know where Mary was during in this particular time. We don't necessarily know. However, Mary comes from a town that's on the Galilee called McDowell. And McDowell was known for its salted fish. And salted fish was the equivalent of our pizza today. It was everywhere. Everybody wanted this salted fish. So the presumption would be that Mary's family was somehow associated with this industry, which is why she's a woman of means. And it is my belief, based off of all when I catalog Jesus's sayings, Jesus had money. He talked about money the most. That was his number one subject. And the way that he talked about money, it was broken down into four subjects. There was the merchant, there's the estate or the plantation, there was working with your hands, and there was inheritance. And when it came to the merchant and when it came to the estate, it just made no sense to me that he would somehow just know about this without ever being involved in it. And so there's a lot of money concepts that he is now using in his sayings, whether it be investment, capital return, taxes, interest, good and bad labor, management, good and bad management styles, right? There seems to be a very intimate knowledge that he has when it came to money. And that exceeds the idea that I can just observe this. it seems to come from some type of experience that he was directly associated with it. And as Luke says in chapter 8, that Mary, Jesus' mother, was a woman of means.
She also.
So, and that Jesus went to the Passover on pretty much all the time, every month or every year, at least frequently, that leaving the household, and traveling the days that it takes to go down to Jerusalem and then to spend the whole festival there.
Yeah,
that's a big deal. And that they were caravanning with one another. So much so that when they caravaned and they left, when Jesus was 12, they didn't even realize he was gone. Why?
Right.
Because there was such a big group of people that was already traveling along. They just figured Jesus was somewhere, hanging out with somebody.
Yeah.
So
part of the tribe.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we really can't say where Mary is. We can start just to assume that she comes from wealth. She's possibly with the salted fish. Jesus's family is possibly either merchants or they own some estate, and they're creating some type of cash crop, whether it be olive oil or palm trees or palm, figs or whatnot. We don't know.
And is it possible that Mary also was preparing herself for the mystical to come at that time?
It would seem to me, if Jesus is relaying to her these very deep hidden knowledge, that she was capable of understanding that. And so, again, when you look at the Gospel of Thomas, these are very, very heady, very abstract ideas. I consider them like Zen koans. Mm-hmm. They are there to snap the way that you think about things. And they are there to direct you and your focus into a much deeper relationship to abstract ideas. Mm-hmm. And Mary is being exposed to that. Well, as you know, you have to prepare yourself at all times just to receive and understand what some of these deeper ideas were. Yeah. So Jesus will say, when you join the two together, the male and the female, you become one, right? New things happen. Jesus says, if you want to know the Father, know that he was not born of a woman.
Right. The Father being the spiritual.
Right. So you have to really be ready to receive this kind of.
Let's back up just a little tiny bit, because I'd like to expand on that, what Jesus said. If you want to know what there is to know, you need the masculine and feminine.
Right.
So how did he say that?
There's no direct connection to saying this is masculine and this is feminine. Okay, so you will get some close ideas when you get into the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. So he will say that which is not born of women, that which was not born of woman is the Father. Okay, so now we're dealing with the nature of two tendencies here. The masculine side of things and the feminine side of things. So what did these two things mean at that particular time? So let's look at the nature of change, because this is the crux of how this is understood. In the world changes, right? So we have seasons, we have new animals, we have new people, we have new societies, old ideas get replaced with new ones. The world is always in a state of flux. It's always moving, it's always changing. To the ancients, that idea of change was feminine. The idea of masculine is the thing that doesn't change. But it's the one that sees the thing to change. Okay, so we have two ideas. We have the world on one side, and we have the sun on the other. If you look at the sun doesn't change. Right. It only changes position. It doesn't change in constitution. It doesn't change in substance. The idea of the Father is tied to the sun, because it doesn't change, but it sees everything it does. So it's like it's an existing premise, an existing principle that existed before. So there was that which changes and that doesn't change and no change.
So is it fair to say that perhaps Jesus and Mary Magdalene were being the living examples of that?
I believe that Jesus was, as the New Testament writers say, that he is the embodiment of wisdom. And so as wisdom, there's also archetypes to that. And so when Jesus says, I do everything that the Father does, he's the living embodiment of what the Father is. He's showing the way. And part of the way is to include women, which is the feminine side of things. And then when you get into the Gospel of Thomas, when he says you have to join the two together, he's really talking about that.
Yeah.
The male and the female.
In ourselves.
In ourselves.
Right.
But also in our society.
Yes.
So it wasn't just about ourselves. It was also about how we create a new society.
So Thomas was talking about that?
Mm-hmm. And that was this is interesting, because Thomas is one of Jesus' disciples. And Thomas.
We're talking Thomas the doubter,
Thomas was slandered as a doubter.
Thomas was slandered as a doubter. Okay.
And now that raises a whole other issue.
But before we go there, in the Gospel of Thomas, he's talking about joining of the male and the female.
That's right.
Wow.
And that once you do, you open up the self.
I noticed you pointed to your third eye.
You open up the self.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the mythological kind of nature of Christianity, they have it there. It's just they make it literal.
Yeah.
So you have a virgin birth, the waking of ourselves. Okay.
Right.
We have to die to ourselves, which is our crucifixion. Right. And once we do that, then there's the ascension. Mm-hmm. So they have all three components. Mm-hmm. You have to have the rebirth, right? The born again experience. That's a virgin birth. You have to die to your own ego.
Right.
And you have to then, once you do that, then there's the ascension. So they have it all there. Again, I just think that they want to make it all literal.
Right, right. And somehow, for some reason, and I believe a lot of it was the society at the time, the role of women and the combining of the divine masculine and feminine in each one of us was not just marginalized, it was eliminated.
Yeah. So Jesus' ideas were so new and so novel in that society.
And he was really bringing that part alive.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so when he talks about the Father, that's a very Pythagorean idea about the One. Mm-hmm. He's introducing new ideas into a society that is very old. And he recognized that it was important to move into the future, and that our future, the seeds of the future, are what he was bringing into his society. And he felt that the old paradigms were no longer efficient. They no longer served their purpose, right? And so you'll see that Jesus is not interested in the old rites and practices. And he actually says the kingdom of heaven is within you, and he references that each person is like a living stone within a temple.
That's beautiful. And
so that in and of itself kind of points a finger at what the temple was supposed to be, right? So when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is inside of you, the kingdom of heaven, right, God is no longer in the temple.
Right.
There's no longer the need of division between the holies of holies and the rest of everybody else. Yeah. So he breaks that whole paradigm down. And he's, in a sense, he's saying there's a new kingdom, and these are the ways that we can address this new issue. Because at his time was the things that were going on in his time were so difficult and horrific, and they just caused so much division and so much anxiety and so much turmoil, and everybody was in a state of anxiety. And he brought some new light into the world.
That's something people could hang on to.
And yet it's still, they couldn't hang on to.
No.
So
you're not ready till you're ready.
That's right.
So before we finish this segment, where did Mary go after Jesus ascended?
Okay, so I have a couple of theories on this.
Okay.
So I am assuming that Jesus and Mary were married. And it's more than just kind of a belief. I really think that they were. Okay. Both Jesus' family and Mary Magdalene came from money. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, what disciples understood that Jesus was really talking about? Almost none of them. Okay, it was literally zero. Okay. So when he went into Passover, they were all afraid of their death. They were all afraid of being caught. They were all afraid of being arrested. And they didn't want to have any part of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So they huddled together in secret after, while he was being crucified. Only a few went out and braved the idea that we will watch him. Mm-hmm. Okay. At the Last Supper, he says, "Remember me." Now, this is a very important idea. It's not don't eat my body and drink my blood. That's Egyptian. Okay. The Last Supper rite is an Egyptian rite in which you eat the body and the blood of the God. Okay, Jesus wouldn't have said that because he's already said the kingdom of heaven is inside of you. Why do you need to eat him?
Right.
Right? Why do you need to drink his blood? I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
No.
Okay, so there's another element that's put into that.
Mm.
However, I think the original element was there, which is remember me.
Mm.
Okay, this is what I did.
Mm.
Remember all of that. So after Jesus died and Jesus went to the lengths that he did, the question is was there anybody that said, hey, you guys, don't go back fishing? Because what happens when you read when you read the New Testaments, they all go back to the Galilee and they all go fishing. They all go back to their old lives. And I can't imagine Mary Magdalene being a strong, powerful, intelligent woman is going, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
You can't go back and fish after that.
No,
so you guys better rethink what you're doing. And I bet you she was in their face. So much so that Peter couldn't deal with it.
Yeah.
Right? And so he just kind of went on his own way and said, I don't want to have to do Mary. Okay, so we also have in the south of France a memorial to Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're down in what is referred to as Gaul. And there's a memorial of her there. So she, for whatever reason, had to migrate over there to be saved or to find a new life. Mm-hmm. But I can't, I mean, it's just, it would be hard for me not to imagine that this woman was in absolute grief and mourning and just in so much pain that the man that she loved is now dead. And all she gets is the memory. Right. And most people don't even want to remember it. You know, they want to go back to their ways. Right. And so I would imagine she just couldn't deal with that level of neglect.
And she had to get out of Dodge.
And then it's possible that then they started to maybe do something, and she just probably kept pestering him, and then she realized that maybe her life was in danger. Mm. You know, that was taking on a different.
And what about, there's one story about her being pregnant at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Or do you think they had children before that, in between there?
I think that they had a daughter, and her name was Sarah. Okay. And that to keep her safe as well, because Jesus went out on this mission, and he knew he was going to die.
Right.
Right. And so there was a certain level of acceptance that what was going to happen inevitably would lead to his death. Mm-hmm. And his death might be in a similar vein as John the Baptist. So you have to kind of just imagine Jesus going through the process of having to look at all the things that are going on, and then John dies, and it's like, hey, you know what? This is really real. Right? Yeah. This is real.
And it's not pretty.
And this is not pretty. And I've gone through the desert experience. I've gone through 40 days, and I've gone through my temptations, and I've gone through all these like sensory deprivation issues. Mm-hmm. And this is really real. So I think that if they were smart, they ended up, you know, going somewhere and saying, let's just hide everybody here, and I'll go back. It makes sense to me that that would have been something that they would have done.
Okay. So we have Mary Magdalene leaving home and moving to France with her daughter, probably.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, apparently Herod the Great's son ended up becoming the king at Jesus' time. All right. She ends up taking over and taking his brother's wife. Okay, so which is why John said, hey, you're an adulterer. Right. Okay, the wife that Herod the Great takes to make his own wife is the daughter of the king who lives next door in the country next to them. And he didn't take lightly to that. Mm-hmm. So he got really upset. Mm-hmm. And he sent an army and went after Herod for the fact that his daughter was shunned, thrown out of the house for this other woman. Mm. Herod, it says in the accounts, was then exiled to Gaul, which is where Mary went. Which is rather curious because one of Jesus's followers is a woman by the name of Joanna, and she is the wife of the estate manager of Herod the Great. Her husband was Cusa, and he ran the household.
So now we're getting into the Women of Judea, which is our next topic.
Yes.
So how can we finish this topic with the work of Mary Magdalene, and besides just trying to save herself and her daughter and whatever other close people there were, what did she do after? Do we know anything when she moved to Gaul? What happened then?
I don't know any of that.
Yeah.
My feeling is that there's no way for her to take the information that Jesus presented and not live with it. So she had to have carried on that fire inside of him in the kingdom of heaven. Yeah. Just like the rest of the other disciples did. And I think that she probably had some other secret knowledge that he presented that you would find in the Gospel of Thomas.
It would make sense that, after all that learning and sacrifice, that it wouldn't just
you just don't,
done.
Yeah, you just don't let it go. Right.
Yeah.
So she had to seed it somehow. I really don't know how she would have seeded it. She might have just kept pushing the disciples to get out to tell Jesus' story. Mm-hmm. And then she maybe became so much of a pest that they decided that maybe she was to be a target,
Yeah.
And then she also might have been the type that said, hey, you guys, I don't know what this theology that you're developing, but it sure isn't what Jesus is talking about. So, because I believe that there's the Christian theology and then there's Jesus, and the two don't necessarily match.
Right.
So there's some overlap, but there's not much. So the way I look at it is Jesus is A, B, C, and D, and Christianity is C, D, E, and F. There are elements that the two cross over, and there's an overlap, but then there's two other elements, or there's other elements that do not. And so,
including the elevation of women to the level of men, of people.
Being included into the society and being allowed to teach and whatnot. Because as you go through and you look at how Christianity developed in the first century and in the early second century, in the beginning they were put in positions of power, but later they were dismissed and they were kind of suppressed.
So in our next little interview, we're going to talk about the women.
Very good.
In the general women in Judea at the time, and how that shifted when this guy Jesus came along. So thank you, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you.
It's always fun. Thank you, David.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to get a hold of me, I'm at www.davidcollis.com, and my book is Interviewing Jesus the Man.
And that's Collis, Collis. So thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.
Blessings.